So one Saturday morning, there I am sitting on the couch, and I think to myself, hey, do I want to go back to school? I mean, learning stuff, that's good for you, right? But then I thought, wait a second, school means homework, and that is something that I just cannot go back to. So then I thought, hey, I got a better idea. How about I play some Super Metroid? Now, there's something that I can always go back to. And yet, something else also happened recently that's been on my mind. I was over at my friend's house, and he said that his son couldn't get into Super Metroid because after having played Metroid Dread, it was just too hard to go back to. Now, right away, I thought, just give me 10 minutes with the young fella, and I'll get him into Super Metroid, which, coincidentally, my wife and I are scheduled to kid sit him and his brother coming up, so perhaps that's exactly what I'll do. As far as what the problem was, my guess would be that Super Metroid doesn't really tell you where to go, whereas Metroid Dread pretty much constantly nudges you in the direction that you're supposed to be going, which one could argue undermines the whole exploration aspect that Metroid games were founded upon. But either way, if modern games are doing things that are scaring the younger generations away from playing the older games, then that terrifies me because I want these younger generations to be playing these older games. So here's a question for you. Is the reason why us older farts are able to go back and tolerate these older games simply because we grew up with them and therefore are more used to how they operate? Well, perhaps for some of you that's the case, but I can say that for me personally, I was absolute trash at these games as a kid, and it wasn't until I was an adult and I approached them in a completely different way that I finally started getting somewhere in them. So, in my opinion, whether you're a kid or an adult, getting into these older games has more to do with how you approach them, more so than anything else. And obviously, people can go back to these older games. I mean, there's an entire community of people that not only can, but goes out of their way to do so. However, not everybody can, and even for those of us who can, there may still be certain series or games where we cannot. Perhaps one of the best examples I can give of this would be the original Legend of Zelda for NES. Now, whether you think it's a fair opinion to have or not, I have seen so many people say that they just cannot go back to that game after having played the later Zelda games, specifically the 2D ones. And what's interesting is that even the most avid retro gamers who really love these old games will very often say this. Another good example could be Street Fighter 1, and some of you might be thinking, Street Fighter 1? How can I go back to that if I was never even there to begin with? Yeah, a lot of people just started with Street Fighter 2 and weren't even really that aware that Street Fighter 1 was much of a thing. I think something that plays a huge factor in all of this is what order you've played the games in the series in, because you may play one game in the series and it just blows you away and it forms certain expectations you have for the other games so that when you go to play them, maybe they don't live up to those expectations. I mean, expectations play a factor in how we evaluate everything. Let's say you're given a cup of ice cream and you think, hey, I like this. And then you're given after that sugar-free ice cream, which actually, does that even exist? Let's say it does. So you eat that sugar-free ice cream and you think, you know, I might like this if I hadn't already eaten the ice cream with sugar in it. And when it comes to video games, this can apply not just to going back to older games, but also going forward to newer games. Some of you may have played a game in a series and you really enjoyed it. And then you tried to play a more recent installment and you thought, my goodness, this game sucks. In fact, if you're somebody who doesn't play modern games at all, you might be thinking, not only can I go back to older games, I have to go back to older games because all these newer games are a bunch of hoo-ha as far as I'm concerned. concerned. Okay, but one of the other big sticking points I see a lot of people having when it comes to going back to older games is things like limited continues, lack of an ability to save your progress, all things that have more or less been fixed by more modern conveniences, which, funny enough, these are modern conveniences that can be applied retroactively to these older games, with perhaps the biggest one being save states. Pretty much all the problems you ever had with retro games can be alleviated in at least some way or another by good old save states. Your game's too difficult? No problem. With save states, you can just make as many checkpoints as you want to make the game a lot easier. Tired of getting game overs? Well, game over no more. With save states, your progress is always saved so that you can always just start right back where you left off. Gotta go to bed? Well, save states will keep your game intact so that you can save your console from an entire night with the power left on. One of the reasons that people give for not being able to go back to older games that nowadays almost just seems downright bizarre is the visuals of games. Now, if you're talking about the early 3D games, then sure, I can see where you're coming from with that. I totally get the argument that those look a little rough around the edges. But if we're talking about 2D games, there are so many indie games nowadays that use this same visual style that it's pretty widely accepted at this point. And for someone to say that maybe a Super Nintendo game doesn't look good enough visually to play, yeah, that just seems really weird to me now. Although I should point out that how they're hooking up their consoles and to what kind of TV certainly plays a big role in how these older games are gonna look. In fact, quick little story for you. One time somebody came over and just for the heck of it, I showed them the difference between one, a Super Nintendo hooked up to a giant HD television via an RF connection, and to make the deal even sweeter, I stretched it out into widescreen, oh yeah. And then I showed them a Super Nintendo hooked up via RGB SCART converted to component video on a CRT television, and you know what they said to me? They said, "I have been living a lie." But ultimately, when it comes to being able to go back to older games, I think a lot of it just comes down to can you make progress or not. With my friend's kid and Super Metroid, I can almost guarantee you that what probably happened was he spent 5, maybe 10 minutes trying to figure out where to go, what to do, couldn't really figure it out, and so just thought, well, screw this. But with all of that said, it's time for this video's question, which is, what's an older game that you cannot go back to? And because most of you are people who generally like older games, I would imagine you have some pretty interesting choices. So with that, leave your answers down below, and I will see ya in the next video.
He's the retro bird, yeah. And he's talking about video games. He's the red